Today, King Asgard needs urgent help double. The royal palace, high on the hill, was still silent as the king's guard prepared for the day ahead. Inside the palace's stone walls, the king's guard was one of the most respected groups in the entire kingdom. They were known for their unwavering loyalty and unmatched skill in battle. No one dared to challenge them. They stood as a symbol of strength and protection, ready to lay down their lives for the safety of the king and the kingdom. But today, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air. The guards moved about, casting nervous glances at each other. It was as though everyone could feel it, the calm before the storm. One of the senior guards, a seasoned soldier named Samuel, stood at the window of the guardhouse, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. His face was grim, a sign that something was weighing heavily on his mind. Samuel had been a part of the king's guard for over a decade, and in all his years of service, he had never felt the kind of unease that gripped him now. He could hear the faint sound of hooves in the distance, but it wasn't enough to be alarmed. Yet something about the way the sound echoed through the empty streets made his instincts go on high alert. "Samuel, you all right?" called his younger comrade Thomas, who had just entered the room. Thomas was new to the guard, and while he had shown promise, he still lacked the experience that Samuel had gained over the years. Samuel didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the faintest hint of smoke could now be seen rising from the valley below. It was too far for anyone to know what it was, but the smoke was growing thicker, spreading like a dark cloud. "This doesn't feel right," Samuel muttered under his breath almost to himself. Thomas frowned. "What do you mean? It's just some smoke, isn't it?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "No, it's not just smoke. Something's coming. I can feel it." At that moment, a loud horn sounded from the outer walls of the palace. It was a signal, a warning. Samuel and Thomas both turned toward the door, the realization dawning on them that their worst fears had been confirmed. The kingdom was under threat. "Gather everyone," Samuel ordered, his voice firm and steady. "Prepare for an ambush." Within moments, the guards were rushing to their stations, pulling on their armor and grabbing their weapons. Samuel could see the fear in their eyes. Despite their training, no one could ignore the sense of dread that was spreading through the palace like wildfire. As the king's guard quickly mobilized, Samuel made his way to the king's chambers. He had to warn the king and make sure he was safely protected. The royal family had always been the target of enemies who wanted to seize control of the throne. It was no secret that there were rival factions within the kingdom, each eager to take advantage of any weakness. When Samuel reached the king's chambers, he was met by the royal advisors who were already in a frenzy. The king, King Alden, was seated at his desk, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes betrayed his concern. Samuel had served the king for years, and he knew better than anyone that the king's composure was often a sign that things were far worse than they seemed. "Your Majesty," Samuel said, bowing slightly, "we've detected an attack approaching from the east. We need to secure the palace immediately." King Alden looked up at him, his gaze sharp. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We don't know for sure," Samuel replied, "but they're well organized. I can feel it. This isn't just a random raid. This is an attack designed to take the palace." The king nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He rose from his seat and motioned for his advisors to leave. The time for diplomacy had passed. It was now a time for action. "Get my family to the safe room," the king commanded. "Make sure they're protected at all costs." Samuel nodded and turned to leave the room, but just as he reached the door, the king called out to him. "Samuel," King Alden said, his voice low. "If this is a traitor among us, I want them found. I won't let anyone bring harm to my kingdom from within." Samuel hesitated for a moment, considering the king's words. A traitor. The thought made his blood run cold. The idea that someone within the king's guard, someone who had sworn an oath of loyalty, might be working against them was a terrifying possibility. But he couldn't afford to dwell on that now. There was no time. "Yes, your majesty," Samuel said. "I'll find them." As Samuel made his way back to the guardhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than an attack was happening. His gut told him that there was more to this than just a rival kingdom trying to seize power. Someone on the inside had to be feeding them information. The enemy knew too much. The guards were already positioned at their posts, the tension in the air thicker than ever. Samuel quickly took charge, assigning groups to different areas of the palace. It was all happening so quickly, and he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "Stay sharp, everyone," Samuel shouted, his voice carrying over the sounds of the hurried preparations. "This is not just an attack. This is an invasion. We protect the king no matter the cost." The enemy was getting closer, and Samuel's mind raced. How had they gotten so far? Why had they waited until now to strike? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves growing louder, signaling that the enemy was nearing the gates. "Get ready," Samuel yelled as he turned to face his comrades. "This is it." As the gates of the palace were thrown open, Samuel and his fellow guards stood ready. The sound of the enemy's march grew louder, and then, in the distance, they saw it, the first wave of attackers charging toward the palace. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he drew his sword. The battle for the kingdom was about to begin, and there would be no turning back. The king's guard had trained their entire lives for moments like this, but today it felt different. Something told Samuel that this would be a battle unlike any other. With one final look at his comrades, he led the charge, determined to protect the king and his kingdom, no matter what it cost. As Samuel and his fellow guards took their positions, the air was thick with tension. The sound of enemy footsteps grew louder, echoing through the stone streets of the palace like a steady drumbeat. Samuel could feel his heart racing, but he refused to let fear take hold. There was no time for fear. His duty was clear, and he would do whatever it took to protect the king and the kingdom. The first wave of attackers arrived at the palace gates, their battle cries filling the air. Samuel's grip tightened around his sword as he surveyed the scene. The enemy was more organized than he had expected. They didn't look like ordinary raiders. These were seasoned fighters, trained and disciplined, and their numbers seemed to grow with each passing moment. "Hold your ground," Samuel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not let them breach the gates." The guards, despite their fear, stood firm. They knew what was at stake. The palace was their home, and they would protect it with their lives if necessary. The clash of steel and the sound of shouts filled the air as the first line of defense engaged the attackers. Samuel was in the thick of it, moving swiftly, parrying strikes, and slashing through enemies with precision. Every swing of his sword was a reminder that the enemy was not going to make it easy. But as the battle raged on, something began to bother Samuel. There was something off about this attack. The enemy didn't just seem prepared, they seemed to know exactly where to strike. The guards were fighting valiantly, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap. The enemy knew the layout of the palace. They knew where the guards were stationed. They knew where to hit hardest. "Something's wrong," Samuel muttered under his breath as he blocked a blow from one of the attackers. "This isn't just an ambush, it's planned, too well planned." His suspicions only deepened as the battle continued. Every time the guards pushed forward, the enemy pulled back just enough to keep them at bay. It was as if they were testing the palace's defenses, probing for weaknesses. The enemy wasn't rushing to defeat them. They were biding their time, waiting for something. Samuel's mind raced. How had the enemy gathered so much information? The palace had been fortified for years, and the king's guard had always been prepared for any attack. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt as though they were being watched, manipulated. "Sir, we need reinforcements," Thomas, his younger comrade, shouted from across the courtyard. Samuel turned to see him fighting off an attacker, but his eyes were wide with concern. "We can't hold them off much longer." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He could already see it. There were too many enemies. The royal guards were outnumbered, and they were being pushed back. The sound of more enemies approaching from the east confirmed his worst fear. This was just the beginning. "We need help, and we need it now," Samuel barked to the nearest group of guards. "Go to the signal tower. Send word to the neighboring kingdoms. We need reinforcements fast." Without hesitation, the guards ran toward the signal tower, where a horn would be sounded to call for help. Samuel turned his attention back to the battle, his sword swinging with deadly precision. He fought alongside his comrades, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the nagging thought. They had been caught off guard. The enemy had been prepared. Someone had to be feeding them information. But who? Who among them could be the traitor? As he fought, Samuel's thoughts flickered to the king. Had the king been safely moved to the secret chambers yet? Samuel had instructed the royal family to be escorted there, but he couldn't be sure that they were safe. The king's safety was paramount, and he needed to ensure that the royal family remained hidden until the battle was won. "Samuel!" a voice shouted from behind him. It was Thomas again, struggling to break through the chaos. "I found something strange." Samuel didn't hesitate. He pushed through the throng of attackers and rushed to Thomas's side. "What is it?" Thomas's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He handed Samuel a small, folded piece of parchment. Samuel took it and unfolded the paper quickly. His eyes skimmed the contents and his blood ran cold. It was a list, names, locations, and specific details about the palace's defenses. The information was too accurate, too detailed to be a coincidence. Samuel could feel his stomach twist in a knot as he read the names of several of the palace guards. His worst fears were coming to life. "There's a traitor among us," Samuel whispered. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. He had suspected it, but seeing it in black and white confirmed it. The enemy had been inside their walls for months, feeding them everything they needed to know about the palace's layout and the king's guards' movements. "Who?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is it?" Samuel shook his head, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "I don't know yet, but we need to find out now." Before they could say anything more, the sound of hooves filled the air. Samuel looked up, his heart sinking. The reinforcements weren't coming fast enough. The enemy had already arrived in full force. They were breaking through the gates, pushing past the guards with brutal efficiency. "We need to fall back," Samuel ordered, his voice filled with urgency. "Protect the king and the royal family. We can't risk them getting caught in the crossfire." He turned to lead the way to the safe room, but as he did, he heard a loud crash from behind him. A group of attackers had breached the palace walls and were charging into the courtyard. Samuel's pulse quickened. This was it, the final push. "Form a line," Samuel shouted to the remaining guards. "Don't let them pass." The guards rallied together, forming a line of defense. Samuel stood at the front, his sword raised, ready for whatever came next. He could feel the weight of his responsibilities on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to fail now. The king, the kingdom, and the people depended on him. As the first wave of attackers rushed toward them, Samuel steeled himself for the fight ahead. He didn't know how long they could hold out, but he was determined to give everything he had. The kingdom's fate rested on their shoulders, and he wouldn't let it fall without a fight. But even as they fought, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about the traitor. Who could it be? Someone among them had turned against the kingdom, and that betrayal would haunt him until he could root it out. For now, though, there was no time for answers. Only the battle mattered. With a battle cry, Samuel led the charge, swinging his sword with all his strength. The fight for the palace was far from over, and the king's guard would do whatever it took to defend their home. The battle outside raged on, but within the walls of the royal palace, The stakes were higher than ever. Samuel's mind raced as he fought with everything he had. Each swing of his sword, each strike against the enemy felt like it brought him one step closer to uncovering the truth. But as the battle intensified, his thoughts kept returning to the parchment Thomas had handed him earlier. The list of names. The details about the palace's defenses. The traitor. Who could it be? Samuel muttered under his breath as he pushed another enemy soldier to the ground. His thoughts were in turmoil. The list had named several guards, some he had known for years, others only a short time. Could one of them really be a traitor? Could someone Samuel had trusted for so long be working against the very kingdom they had sworn to protect? The enemy had been prepared, too prepared. They knew when to strike, where to strike, and how to cause maximum damage. That wasn't just luck. It wasn't coincidence. Someone had been feeding them information, and it could only be someone on the inside. But the question still lingered in his mind: who? Who among them could betray the king? As Samuel fought off another attacker, he saw Thomas running toward him, his face pale with worry. The young guard's eyes were wide, and his breath came in ragged gasps. "Samuel, we've got a problem," Thomas said, grabbing his arm. "They're breaking through the gates faster than we thought, and there's something else. I found something in the royal quarters." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Every second counted now. He couldn't afford distractions, not when the palace was under siege. Thomas pulled out a second piece of parchment, one that was even more troubling than the first. "This," he said, handing it over. "It's a list of guards on duty for the royal family, but there's something strange. Some of the names, they're not supposed to be on this list. They're listed as being assigned to positions they shouldn't have access to." Samuel's mind raced as he studied the names on the parchment. Several of the guards listed were his own comrades, people he had trusted without question. One of the names in particular stood out to him: Marcus, a senior guard who had served under Samuel for nearly 5 years. Marcus had always been reliable, always put the kingdom first, or so Samuel had thought. "This doesn't make sense," Samuel muttered, his fingers tightening around the parchment. "Marcus is one of the last people I'd expect to." "Samuel, you don't have time to think about it right now," Thomas interrupted urgently. "We need to get the royal family to safety. The enemy is getting closer." Samuel's blood ran cold. Thomas was right. Every minute they wasted, every second they spent wondering who the traitor was, brought the enemy one step closer to achieving their goal. The palace, the king, and the royal family were in immediate danger. Samuel couldn't afford to let anything or anyone get in the way of his duty. "Get the rest of the guards together," Samuel said, his voice commanding. "We're moving the royal family to the secret chambers. Now." The two of them rushed toward the inner palace halls, where the royal family was supposed to be hidden away. The corridors, usually quiet and dignified, were filled with the sounds of hurried footsteps and anxious whispers. Samuel kept his hand on his sword, ready to fight off anyone who dared to get in their way. When they reached the royal quarters, they found the king and his family in a state of controlled panic. King Alden stood at the center, his face stoic but his eyes filled with worry. The queen was beside him, along with their 2 children, the prince and princess. Samuel's heart went out to them. The royal family had been caught in the middle of this chaos, and they had no idea how deep the betrayal went. "Your Majesty, we must move you immediately," Samuel said, his voice urgent but respectful. King Alden didn't hesitate. "I know, Samuel, take us to the safe room." But as they prepared to move, something strange happened. A loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of distant shouting. The palace was under attack, and the enemy was getting closer. Samuel's grip tightened around his sword. "Move quickly," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close to me." As they made their way through the winding corridors, Samuel's thoughts began to race again. They had to get the royal family to safety, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something wrong. The parchment Thomas had shown him, the names of the guards in the wrong places. Was Marcus really the traitor, or was there someone else? There was no time for questions now. Samuel pushed those thoughts aside. He had to focus on the present, on protecting the royal family. As they neared the secret chambers, Samuel's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in front of the hidden door, was Marcus, the senior guard. "Marcus," Samuel called out, his voice hard. "What are you doing here?" Marcus looked up, his face momentarily frozen in surprise. But then something shifted in his eyes, a coldness, a darkness that hadn't been there before. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. "I'm here to make sure the royal family is safe," Marcus said, his voice calm but too smooth, too controlled. Samuel took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving to his sword. Something wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his gut. "I'll take it from here, Samuel," Marcus said, stepping closer to the door. "You should focus on the fight outside." But Samuel wasn't fooled. His mind raced as he remembered the list of names Thomas had shown him. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here. And now, in this moment of crisis, Marcus was standing in front of the royal family's safe room, blocking their entrance. "You're not taking anyone anywhere," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Step aside, Marcus." For a moment, Marcus didn't move. He just stared at Samuel, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow smile, he finally stepped aside. "Of course, Samuel," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "But I'm afraid it's too late for them." Samuel didn't wait another second. He shoved Marcus aside and opened the door to the secret chambers. Inside, the royal family was waiting, unaware of the danger that had almost caught them. Samuel ushered them in quickly, his mind still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus wasn't the only threat lurking within the palace walls. As the royal family entered the safe room, Samuel turned to Thomas. "Stay with them," he ordered. "I'll handle this." Thomas nodded, his face pale but determined. "Be careful, Samuel." Samuel gave him a quick nod before turning back to the hallway. He had to confront the truth. The traitor was still out there, and now he knew it wasn't just Marcus. It was someone else, someone more dangerous. The fight was far from over, and the real battle was only just beginning. The door to the secret chambers clicked shut behind Samuel, but the weight of what he had just uncovered hung heavily on his shoulders. Marcus, a guard Samuel had trusted, had stepped aside too easily. The calm smile on his face had been too perfect, too rehearsed. Samuel's instincts screamed at him. Something was terribly wrong. As he stood outside the hidden room, keeping an eye on the royal family, Samuel's mind raced. Marcus couldn't have been working alone. There was no way. The enemy knew too much, had planned too precisely. And now, as the sound of battle outside grew louder, Samuel could feel the walls of the palace closing in on him. The kingdom had been betrayed, and Samuel had no idea who was responsible. His thoughts flickered back to the list Thomas had shown him. Names, positions, and movements of the guards that had been altered. The enemy had insider knowledge. Someone close to the king, someone in the palace, was feeding them everything they needed. Samuel couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to find the traitor, and quickly. But who could it be? Marcus had been one of the senior guards, a trusted ally, but the fact that he was standing in front of the safe room trying to block their path couldn't be overlooked. Was Marcus the traitor, or was he simply another pawn in a much larger game? Taking a deep breath, Samuel straightened himself and turned back to the hallway. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront the situation head-on. But time was running out. The palace was under siege, and the royal family's safety was still in question. If Marcus was the traitor, that meant the enemy was already within the gates, and the battle outside was just a distraction. "Stay alert," Samuel muttered to himself, gripping his sword tightly as he moved down the corridor. His footsteps echoed against the stone floor, and every turn he took seemed to bring him closer to the truth. but also deeper into danger. The palace was vast, and the number of corridors and hidden rooms seemed endless. Whoever the traitor was, they had the perfect environment to stay hidden. Samuel passed by the rooms where the guards were stationed, their faces grim, their eyes filled with worry. Every one of them was on edge, ready for anything, but none of them knew the depth of the threat they were facing. It wasn't just an invasion from outside. The enemy was inside, too, and they were working against the very people who had sworn to protect the king. He came to a stop outside Marcus's quarters, his heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Samuel could see shadows moving inside. He didn't need to be told what was going on. This was where Marcus had been stationed before the attack had begun. If Marcus was the traitor, then this was the place to find the answers. Samuel's hand hovered over the door, but just as he was about to push it open, he heard a sound. A faint whisper, too quiet for anyone else to hear, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. He stepped back from the door, listening intently. The whisper came again, followed by another voice. A conversation. Samuel couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking it. The voices were familiar. Without thinking, he slid down the hallway and into a small alcove out of sight. From there, he had a clear view of Marcus's quarters. The door creaked open, and two figures stepped into the hallway. It was Marcus, and he was speaking to someone Samuel didn't recognize. A tall man with dark hair, dressed in black armor, clearly not one of the palace guards. "So, it's done?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "They're moving the royal family to the safe room now. The guards are distracted. It won't be long before we have full control of the palace." Samuel's heart dropped into his stomach. He had been right. Marcus was the traitor. And it seemed that the enemy had already infiltrated the palace. The royal family was supposed to be safe, but now Samuel realized that the safe room wasn't as secure as it should have been. They had been lured into a trap. "We need to move quickly," the man in black said. "The king is still a threat. If we don't eliminate him soon, the rebellion will fall apart." "Don't worry," Marcus said, his voice calm and controlled. "The king won't survive this. Once we take control of the palace, the rest will be easy. We just need to hold off the remaining guards until the reinforcements arrive." Samuel's fists clenched around the hilt of his sword. He had heard enough. Marcus had been working with the enemy all along. But the worst part was yet to come. He had been planning to take control of the kingdom. He had been playing everyone. Samuel knew he had to act fast. The two men turned and started to walk away from the door, but Samuel didn't wait. He moved quickly, silently, closing the distance between them with the practiced skill of a guard who had spent years learning to move unseen. When he was close enough, he stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. "Marcus," Samuel said, his voice hard with determination. Marcus froze. The tall man in black turned quickly, his hand reaching for a dagger at his side, but Samuel was faster. With one swift motion, he disarmed the man and knocked him to the ground. "Samuel," Marcus said, his voice filled with surprise, though it was quickly replaced by anger, "you should have stayed out of this." "You've betrayed everything you swore to protect," Samuel said, his voice cold. "The kingdom, the king, the royal family, they trusted you. And now you've led them into a trap." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Samuel saw a flicker of fear. But then it was gone. Instead, Marcus straightened himself, his stance shifting as if he was preparing for a fight. "It's too late for you to stop anything," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're too loyal to see the truth. The king's reign is over. The kingdom belongs to those who are strong enough to take it." Before Samuel could react, Marcus drew his sword and lunged. The clash of metal filled the air as Samuel blocked the attack, barely managing to keep his footing. This was it. The confrontation he had been avoiding had finally arrived. They fought in silence, each move calculated, each strike powerful. Samuel could feel his muscles aching with the effort, but he refused to give an inch. Marcus was fast, skilled, and dangerous, but Samuel had the strength of loyalty and duty on his side. The fight seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus was relentless, his movements fueled by the belief that he was destined to rule. Samuel, on the other hand, fought with everything he had for the kingdom, for the king, and for the people who trusted him. Finally, with a powerful swing, Samuel disarmed Marcus, knocking the sword from his hand and sending it clattering to the ground. Marcus fell to his knees, panting heavily, his face twisted with rage. "You've lost," Samuel said, his voice low but filled with finality. "It's over," but Marcus didn't respond. He just stared at Samuel, his eyes dark with bitterness. "You may have won this battle," he said, his voice filled with venom, "but the war is far from over." Samuel didn't respond. He simply watched as Marcus was taken away by the other guards. The kingdom had been betrayed, but the fight wasn't over. The enemy was still out there, and Samuel knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The battle had slowed, but the war was far from over. Samuel stood in the dimly lit corridor, watching as the palace guards hauled Marcus away, his face still twisted in anger. The traitor had been caught, but the weight of his betrayal hung heavy in the air. The king was still in danger, and the kingdom was far from safe. Samuel knew that there was still work to be done, work that required more than just defeating an enemy on the battlefield. He turned away from the scene and walked quickly toward the royal chambers. The sound of his boots echoed through the empty halls, each step a reminder of the responsibility he carried. The royal family needed to be protected. The kingdom needed to be secured. But even now, as Samuel walked through the palace, he couldn't help but feel the heaviness of the truth he had uncovered. The enemy had been inside the palace for longer than anyone had realized. Marcus was just the tip of the iceberg. Samuel's mind raced as he reached the king's chambers. The door was slightly ajar, and as he stepped inside, he was greeted by the sight of King Alden, seated at a table with his advisors. The tension in the room was palpable. The king's face, though composed, was a reflection of the worry that had been building up since the attack had begun. "Samuel," the king said, looking up as Samuel entered. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of exhaustion beneath it. "What's the situation?" "The palace is secure for now, Your Majesty," Samuel said, his voice firm. "The traitor has been apprehended, but there may be others who were involved. The enemy is not just outside the gates, they've been inside our walls for a long time." The king's eyes narrowed. "Who else?" "Do we have names?" Samuel hesitated, remembering the list that Thomas had shown him earlier. "There may be others, but I don't have enough information yet. Marcus was the one who orchestrated most of the attack, but I suspect there are still others working in the shadows." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed Samuel's words. The weight of the truth settled over them like a heavy fog. The royal family, their trusted guards, their kingdom, everything had been vulnerable. Samuel knew that their enemies were smarter than they had given them credit for. The traitors inside the palace had done their job well. "We'll need to do a thorough search of the palace," one of the advisors, Lord Garrick, said, his voice filled with urgency. "Every corner, every chamber, every guard. We can't afford any more surprises," Samuel nodded. "I'll make sure it's done. The enemy is clever, but we have the advantage now." The king stood up and walked over to Samuel, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have asked of you, Samuel. The kingdom owes you a debt, but we're not finished yet. There's still much to be done." Samuel nodded, though a part of him couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. The traitors may have been uncovered, but there was still the possibility of more hidden threats within the palace walls. "Your Majesty," Samuel said, "with your permission, I'd like to lead the search. We need to root out every last trace of the enemy before they regroup." The king's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with a deep understanding. "Do what you must, Samuel, I trust you." With the king's blessing, Samuel immediately set to work. He gathered the most trusted guards, those who had proven their loyalty, and began a systematic search of the palace. Each room, each hallway, each corner was scoured, and no one was left unchecked. The palace was vast, and Samuel knew that even the smallest detail could be the difference between safety and danger. As the hours passed, Samuel's frustration grew. They had found no further signs of treason, no more traitors, no hidden plots, but the sense of unease remained. Something still didn't feel right. The enemy's forces were scattered, but Samuel knew that they were still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, as the day began to fade into night, Samuel met with the king again. The search had turned up nothing. No more traitors, no more hidden weapons. But still, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was not truly over. "Your Majesty," Samuel said, kneeling before the king, "the palace is clear. We've found no further signs of the enemy within the walls. But I cannot rest until I am certain that the danger has passed. The enemy will regroup, and when they do, we need to be ready." King Alden regarded Samuel with a solemn expression, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "You've done everything in your power to protect us, Samuel. But I think you're right. There may be more waiting in the shadows. We cannot lower our guard just yet." Samuel stood, his resolve hardening. "I will continue to watch, Your Majesty. I will not rest until the kingdom is safe." The king gave him a nod, then turned to his advisors. "We will begin rebuilding, starting with the most vital areas. The royal family will remain in the safe chambers for the time being, and we will continue to strengthen our defenses. But I agree with Samuel. We cannot afford to let our enemies believe they have won." Samuel's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the door. He knew what had to be done. He needed to find the remaining forces of the enemy and finish what they had started. It wasn't enough to simply defend the palace anymore. They had to go on the offensive. "I will begin organizing the guards," Samuel said. "We need to make sure every possible escape route is sealed. The enemy will not be able to get away." The king nodded. "Go, Samuel. Do what you must." As Samuel left the royal chambers, his mind was already racing ahead. He had done his duty. He had exposed the traitor. He had protected the royal family. But there was still so much left to do. The fight wasn't over. The kingdom needed him now more than ever. He gathered his most trusted men and began preparing for what came next. The streets outside were quieter now, but Samuel knew that peace was an illusion. The enemy was still out there, and the king's guard was the last line of defense. For the next few days, the palace remained on high alert. Guards patrolled every corner, every entrance. The royal family stayed in their safe chambers, and the palace was fortified as best as possible. But despite all the precautions, Samuel's instincts told him that something was coming. The enemy was out there, planning their next move. In the end, Samuel never did find the remaining forces of the enemy, but he was ready for them when they did strike. And when the day came, as it inevitably did, Samuel and the king's guard stood together, ready to protect the kingdom at any cost. The battle for the kingdom would continue, but Samuel knew one thing for sure. As long as he stood, the palace would never fall.